All right, welcome back to week 2 of Collision. Thank you to those who viewed last week and joined us for Q&A. It's kind of fun. I did challenge some of the high schoolers if they could throw out a question last week for postmodernism that would stump me. And even Neil added that I would buy them lunch. None of them seemed to want to take up that challenge, unfortunately. Maybe this week they'll throw something at me. So we invite the questions. They're good. Open-ended questions, very specific questions, things that you're wanting to know from this subject. That'll kind of lead the answers, really. And so, because we want to answer some of your questions that come out of this in real ways. And you can always comment back on Facebook Live, like, hey, what about this? You just answered that question, but hey, can you maybe say a little bit about that? We want to make sure you get the answers to your questions. So please, but thank you for coming back. So this week we're going to look at scientism. Scientism, another very prevalent philosophy going on in our culture, in Western society at large currently, other than postmodernism. Should be a little easier to grapple with this week, a little more straightforward, not as ambiguous as postmodernism. But to set the stage here, if I can just ad lib, I forgot to write down an intro, so I'm going to kind of ad lib one to kind of paint the picture here. So let's say, here in Toma, you go to a weekend barbecue at somebody's house. Summer's coming up, weather's getting nice. You're at a barbecue hanging out, and somebody at the party's visiting. Maybe he's a visiting professor or something from University of Wisconsin, and he's at the party as well. And he happens to be an adherent to scientism. And so you're sitting there, he finds out you're a Christian, he comes over and starts questioning you about your faith and tells you something along the lines of that, that's all well and good for you, that you think those things, but those are all kind of your values, just the things you adhere to. But really what matters is what science tells us. Science is verifiable, it's empirical, we can know if it's true. And if science trumps your ideas of morals and religion, and really the only way to get at real truth is through science and through testable science. And he challenges you, what do you do in that moment? What do you say? Well, we're going to look at the idea that individual is coming at you with, their philosophy, and then we're going to look at some things, some answers that maybe we can provide, some critiques of scientism and how we may stand firm against it. So what is scientism? Well, there's two types of scientism. There is, first, strong scientism. Strong scientism is simply what it says here, would hold that something is true only if it is scientific, only if it has been proved by the scientific method. So somebody that holds a strong scientism would think that a proposition or a statement is true or rational if and only if it is a scientific proposition or statement. That is, there are no truths apart from scientific truth. Knowledge and beliefs are rational and justified only if they are vouched for by science. And very specifically, the hard sciences, not social science, wouldn't be like anthropology, but looking at physics, chemistry, cosmology, things like that. So that's type 1, strong scientism. The second one is weak scientism. Weak scientism would hold that truth may be found apart from science. There may be some minimal amount of even positive truth that we can get, but ultimately science is the authority for human knowledge. So weak scientists would say that science will aid us in gaining knowledge in any and every field of study. Any idea or issue is rationally justified, so you're only justified or being logical about believing it only insofar as it has support from science. Therefore, we should be using science to help us understand everything. Science should infuse everything. But the question is, from a weak or strong view of scientism, is scientism really all it's cracked up to be? So to help paint a picture, maybe sometimes picture speaks 1,000 words. What is scientism? Well, I've got a picture here that somewhat humorous, but I think honestly sums up scientism. It's almost, and they would probably hate this word, almost like a worship of science. Science is all. But very importantly, this is something we have to understand. You have to understand this. Got it? Scientism is not science. You can do good science without adhering to scientism. And just because you adhere to scientism does not mean that you are doing science. All right, so our next slides, there's a bedfellow of scientism. It's scientism's companion, that is naturalism. And again, there are two types of naturalism. The first type would be philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism would say only what is natural is real. That is, nature is all there is. So if that's the case, nature is all there is, then no essences exist. So with no essences exist, basically only matter is real. Only that which is nature. And nature is really just a brute fact. It just exists. How it exists, why it exists, isn't really an answerable question or one that we need to deal with. We just know that it just does. That's philosophical naturalism. The next one is methodological naturalism. This is an interesting one because some people who are, even from a Christian perspective, some people they're okay with a certain level of methodological naturalism. Other people just hate it across the board. They would disregard it. But methodological naturalism is using the scientific approach to acquire and assess scientific information. Basically, when you're in your high school or college chemistry class, you are going through a method of scientific inquiry to test a hypothesis and reach a conclusion. That's okay. Christian scientists do that. Here's the issue that some people have with methodological naturalism, is that when a scientist does science and they say, hey, this is what science tells us. And sometimes science doesn't tell us the whole picture. This is all science tells us. This is the answer we got from a natural explanation, but we know that's not all the answer. That's okay. Where it goes wrong is when they say the natural explanation has no real answer, so therefore there is no answer. Where a Christian could approach it and say, well, okay, we didn't get an answer specifically that science could give us, but there are other things out there, other ways to gain truth. And so science ended, but other things can fill that in. So methodological naturalism is not necessarily bad. It can. Some people use it quite well. The problem is when that natural explanation ends, and because there's no natural explanation, you make missteps and you make claims that reach beyond science and end up becoming absurd. For instance, extreme naturalistic, evolutionary naturalist, an atheist, Daniel Dennett, when speaking of the creation of the universe, remember, he was struggling with, okay, science only gets us to the beginning. How did it all come to be, right? What's the origin? There's no natural explanation for him, and so he went so far in his writings to write, in the ultimate bootstrapping trick, the universe created itself from nothing. That's crazy. I mean, that is the definition of absurd and poor logic. But again, he's using methodological naturalism, and then when that ends, he throws in his philosophical naturalism. So we've got scientism and naturalism, which play quite closely together. But just like we did last week, we're going to look at a few areas. Last week we looked at language and interpretation. This week, then people or personhood and morality. This week we're still going to look at personhood and morality, but we're going to look at reality, or personhood and morality, if I did not say that, sorry. This week, instead of language and interpretation, we're going to look at reality on scientism. So what is reality on scientism? Well, reality would be only that which is testable or identifiable identifiable by science. That is, what is natural, nature. Just as a couple quick things, can we prove love using only nature? Can you demonstrate and prove your love for somebody? Now, there may be some chemical reactions that happen, but is that all love is? What about your attraction? Surely it seems when you're attracted to somebody, yeah, there may be some release of some hormones, but when you look at that person, you would think to yourself, there is more than just the release of chemicals that I find attractive or that I love about this person. But they would say only that which is testable and identifiable by science is reality. So nothing immaterial and nothing supernatural exists. That excludes God, that excludes the soul or the immaterial mind, as some philosophers will call it, any existence of any type of spirits. Those would all be considered non-existent on scientism. And finally, reality on scientism, what we get is, I talked briefly about it so far, and it came up in the Q&A a little bit last week, is it's called the fact-value dichotomy or fact-value distinction, where science, specifically the hard sciences on scientism, they give us fact, testable, relatable, proved facts. And then areas of morality, ethics, religion, philosophy, some of these more social sciences, those are just values. Right? They're not factual, they're value-based. And so you can think those things, but just know what you think or believe are just your values, and those aren't facts. All right? So they try to create this dichotomy, which gives then science kind of this upper hand. So that is reality on scientism. Next would be personhood. So personhood on scientism. First, you are just physical stuff. You have no essence. People are physical with zero essence. What that means is that you are identical to your body and just a bundle of physical things. You are not distinct from your body. There's nothing about you that is distinct from your body in any way, shape, or form. And this is simply because you have the same exact properties without any difference or distinction from your body. So now we are going to go into a quick logic break. All right, we're going to have some fun with some logic here a little bit. This is the fun part of the show for me. Okay, logic break today. We're gonna see what that means to be identical. All right, and there are some more nuanced and deeper ways to express this, but I think this will suffice for our needs now. For every attribute A or property P that your body has, you also have it. And for every attribute A or property P that your body doesn't have, you also don't have it. All right, so that first one, for every attribute A or property P that your body has, you also have it. So if your body has an arm or two arms, you have two arms. As my wife pointed out earlier, so does that mean that if your body had three arms, you would have three arms? Yes. If your body has a pituitary gland, you have a pituitary gland. And for every attribute A, the bottom portion, or property P that your body doesn't have, you also don't have. So if your body has no essence, you have no essence. If your body has no essential or intrinsic properties, you have no essential or intrinsic properties. You and your body are the same thing, or said even more simply, you are nothing more than your body. Next, for personhood. Since you're just physical stuff with no essence, you have no soul. You have no spirit. There's nothing exists apart from you other than that physical piece. And finally, with personhood, you have no, and I put in parentheses there, philosophical free will, and you are causally or scientifically determined. I put those in parentheses because I want to differentiate. There can be a difference and a nuance between theological free will, like kind of what we look at as Christians, and philosophical free will. But from a philosophical perspective, you have no free will. You are utterly determined. And there it is, you are causally or scientifically determined. There's no free will that exists for you. On to morality. Morality from a point of scientism. Morality is inherently subjective and a private matter. When I say inherently subjective, that means it's not objective. There's nothing that weighs on us objectively. It can be what you think or what society agrees to or what society says. It's not that society goes, murder is absolutely objectively wrong. No matter what, it's wrong. Therefore, we should do it. It's more like, well, we'll say it's wrong. Or if it's subjective, then we couldn't really say that Hitler was wrong. Now, we might make some case for it of why we think it is, but it wouldn't be objectively wrong. And objective means that it's independent of what anybody thinks or feels about it. So it's subjective, and at times even a private matter. You know, what happens behind closed doors, or what happens between two people, or in a certain organization, whatever happens there, that's what happens there. Just let's not talk about it. Let's keep it private. But it is ultimately subjective, seen through our eyes, and as what is, rather than a big picture, kind of like we talked about postmodernism, like this thing that weighs on us. That doesn't exist. Morality, practically speaking, what it plays out to be is morals are effectively morale. So if the morale of people is high, morals must be good. People seem to be happy. Their bodies and seem to be fairly healthy. All the hormones and thoughts and things going through their body seem to be ones of contentment, of peace, and some type of happiness. So therefore, morals are good because morale is high. And this is important, I think, for morality. It is descriptive and not prescriptive. That's where that prescriptive would be what comes with objective moral values, like you can't do this. It's prescribed to you that that's wrong. Or a law. Our laws say you cannot do this, but you can do this. You can't go over the speed limit. That's prescribing to us that this is wrong. So it's descriptive. And what descriptive means is it just looks out and says, like for instance right now, I look out and I see a stack of chairs. That's just describing what is. So if I look out and see people, a host of men cheating on their wives, it just describes what is. But I can't say that that's wrong objectively. So if you really wanted to know what morality would be, maybe take a survey. Collect everybody and what are going to be the local laws in Toma. Collect everybody in Toma, have them take a survey of what currently is going on, and that would be the morality. It just describes what is rather than prescribes what should be, or a good word is prescribes what ought to be the case. So let's get into a few critiques. This can be kind of fun, hopefully not too over the top. Remember, these are a few critiques. There are more things that could be said in each of these sections. A few critiques. So on scientism itself, we'll look at that. Strong scientism is self-refuting. All right? Strong scientism, that's really the only critique you need, is that something is self-refuting, and it should just go away. Unfortunately, it's not. A more philosophical way to say that is it is self-referentially incoherent. So, if scientism says only what is testable by science can be true, that is a self-defeating statement. Because what it's saying is that something must be testable to be true. Right? It's making testability for truth a requirement. And then it states that what scientism is saying is that statement itself only what is testable by science can be true is true. But that proposition or statement itself, only what is testable by science can be true, can't be tested by science. So in itself, that can't be true because it can't be tested by science. The criteria it's setting up for itself for truth, it doesn't even meet. So it's self-refuting. Weak scientism. So the weaker version, maybe that can go a little further, right? It's not quite as stuck in science. It allows for some other things. It's not quite so rigid. Maybe it can survive. However, weak scientism relies on non-scientific assumptions and foundations. So that can be a bold claim, right? I'm making this claim. It relies on non-scientific things as its foundation. Well, so if it's saying everything, just to kind of paint that picture, if it's saying that everything other than science is poor or can't provide truth, but then it relies on that, it's only as strong as its foundation. And if it relies on philosophy and other things for its foundation, then its foundation must be quite weak by its own admission. Growing up in California and starting to work out when I was young, we had those things called California bodybuilders. You know, the guys who only did bench press, curls, and occasionally like some back stuff. So you see these giant dudes. They would weigh like 200 pounds on their upper body, and then they would weigh like 8 pounds on their lower body. They stood on toothpicks, you know. They looked really, really strong up here, but a slight to moderate breeze would knock them over because they had no strong foundation. That's what weak scientism is relying on. It's relying on a foundation that it is saying is weak. So if I'm making that claim, what are some of those things that are non-scientific that it has to have in place as its foundation to even get off the ground? Well, I wrote 6 down. There's more, but I wrote 6 down. Logical and mathematical truths. It uses those as a foundation and assumes them to be true, where if science tried to prove them with science, it would be reasoning in a circle. Another one, metaphysical truths. It just assumes those to be true as its foundation. Number 3, the uniformity principle of nature. It assumes that nature is uniform in its causes. It has to assume that in order to do science. It can't prove it with science, but it has to assume it. It assumes that our senses are reliable gatherers of truth, that when I see, taste, touch, hear things, whether individually or collectively us coming together, we can actually see things in a reliable way. It assumes that, but it can't prove that. It assumes the fundamental laws of nature. It can't prove those fundamental laws, but it assumes those and rests on those. And it assumes, finally, that truth exists and we can know it. None of those 6 things I just listed are provable by science. They have to be assumed by science in order to do science. Really, all of those can be subsumed under a category of philosophy and even arguably theology. So there's a perfect example of what the relationship between scientism and philosophy. So a few critiques on personhood, scientific personhood. Man, my thing keeps dropping down here. All right, scientific personhood. What about sameness or identity through time? It would seem to most of us to be pretty obvious and reasonable that we are the same person throughout our life. That I would assume that the James Forbes of 10 years old, that I'm that same person. There's some changes that have happened, but I continue to exist, what philosophy would call as a continuant. I continue to exist. I was me at 10. I'm still me at 20, at 30, at 40 now. I'll still be me if God allowed me to live to 80. I'll still be me. It's me that I am existing, have an identity through time. That seems to be the case for most of us, and it seems reasonable and almost even obvious, if not evident to us. But if that's not the case, which on natural or scientism and naturalism it can't be, you are only a material thing, and material things change. And the moment something changes, it is no longer, we talked about this earlier, identical to itself. So it is truly, factually no longer the same. And so if that's the case, if I'm not the same person through time because I change, because there's no essence to me, no soul that goes with me, then what does this mean for criminals? Because surely somebody who's sitting on death row for a murder 20 years ago is surely not the same person that committed that murder on scientism or naturalism. They have changed. If I remember my biology right, I think like every cell in the human body, every 7 years, you're effectively a new physical being completely. But even one cell changing changes the identity of that thing. It's no longer exactly identical to that thing. But even if we go to the 7-year thing, well, if he's been sitting on death row for 20 years, that person on death row, from a scientific, scientism view or a naturalistic view, is no longer the same person. Why is he still on death row? He's not the one that killed that person 20 years ago. But we keep him there. Or what about for relationships? So, if you're not the best husband in the world, I think Neil and I would both probably raise our hands on that. He's nodding his head. So, what do you do if your wife comes into the room someday and says, "You've changed. You are not the same man I married"? Well, you'd have one of two options to look at that. You would either say, "Wow, my wife's a good naturalist because she's right. I have changed and I'm not the same person she married." But as a Christian, if she says that and she's saying it as a naturalist, I urge you to pray for her because she needs to be correct. She needs to come to know God and Christ. The other option is that what she's saying is that you're goofed up in some way, and you're still the same person, but you're so goofed up in some way that you have maybe morally or ethically changed from who she married. You're now a bad dude for some reason. And I'm telling you, men, if your wife comes and says you're not the same person anymore, she means the second one. And at that point, we need to ask ourselves the question of what's changed. But it really could be true on naturalism that you're just truly not the same person. Like, you're not the person she married. So we'll think of all the implications of that. So, and next on personhood, there's a thing called intentionality. So when I have thoughts, say I'm thinking about going on a vacation someplace where COVID has not reached and I can openly walk up and down a beach and hang out on a hammock and smoke a cigar, I'm thinking of all those things. My thoughts are actually of that vacation, and they are about the things that I'm going to do, like walk on the beach, sleep in a hammock, smoke a cigar, something of that nature. My thoughts are of and about a thing, but purely physical things are never of or about something else, right? As a matter of fact, I think it was Aristotle that defined the term nothing as that which rocks think about. So, remember, material things, if we are really not much or any different than a rock, we're just a bundle of physical things, how can we be of or about something and have intentionality? Moving on from personhood, looking at morality. Might makes right. So if we're looking at an evolutionary process, survival of the fittest type mentality, the strong survive, the strong lay power over the weak. So whoever's strongest, whoever has the most might, can make their way right. So if Hitler had succeeded and taken over the whole world, his ideology, from a naturalistic perspective, would have been right. It would have been what was descriptive of reality, and he could have made it right just by winning. So might makes right seems to be kind of a ruling idea of morality for scientism and naturalism. Although most people that adhere to scientism would live differently morality. They would try to claim some real morality, but it's hard to understand how they would. The next would be there are issues with human flourishing. A lot of people that would fall under scientism, the majority that I've talked to and the ones I've read, what they will typically try to do is morality is that which aids in human flourishing. Other than being probably what we call a form of speciesism, like our species, because might makes right, we're stronger, we're bigger, our species is more important than everyone else's, so it's our flourishing that matters. Other than that issue, there's also the issue of what if something really bad could be proved to be good for human flourishing? So, what if I could demonstrate somehow that if we went and tortured and killed everybody on the European continent would somehow be good for human flourishing, ultimately aid in the grand scheme of human flourishing? Would that make it right? And what would we define as human flourishing is another question. What makes us flourish ultimately, and how do we justify what aids in that flourishing? So there's a lot of questions around just saying it's just human flourishing. And again, it's subjective, so there's no really solid objective ground we can stand on and say, this is what that means. Absolutely. Doesn't matter what you think, this is the definition of human flourishing. And last, since it lacks a prescription, prescribing what morality is, or the other way to say it is it lacks an ought, like you ought to do this, there's very little reason why I ought to hold to any morality from a position of scientism. If scientism is true, and this is how we've gotten our rules and our laws, is through, or this is how we are going to or should get our rules and laws, when that's established, I don't think there's any compelling reason you could give me for why I should obey or why I ought to obey those laws. You could come up with some reasons like, well, if you don't, we're going to catch you. Well, if I can be a little bit funny, no, you won't. I'm smarter than you. I will figure a way out not to get caught. All right. Well, if you don't do these things and don't fall under our rules, then nobody's going to like you and you won't be popular. Well, that's okay. I don't like you either. You see, no matter what they tell us, if it's not an actual something we ought to do that is grounded in true reality, ultimately there's no reason you can give of why we ought to and maybe even should follow those rules. What you might get from me is I will follow the rules when somebody's watching. I will follow the rules only as far as it's good for me, and then when I can get away with it because it makes me feel better, I'm going to get away with it. So that's the issue when there's no objective prescription or ought, is you're kind of left just grasping at things. So those are some issues with a few critiques of scientism, and again, it's companion naturalism, and how that plays out for morality. So next I want to look at a biblical response to morality, and then we'll look, as we did last week, at a general Christian response. Biblical response. Reality is not just nature. So a couple verses. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God existed and then created the heavens and the earth. So there's something that exists beyond, before. I hate to use the word before because that brings time in, but just don't critique me too much on that. But outside of, transcendent to what is nature. And if we go to 1 Kings, if I can find this really quick, see if I know the order of my Bible well. 1 Kings 8:27. It says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built." So, if all of created order, all of nature, heavens and the highest heavens, and the earth, which listed there, cannot contain God. If he was so big that he would fill all that, if he was natural, we would see him and clearly. But he exists, that he can't even be contained in that. He's beyond and above those things. And looking at the New Testament, Luke 24:39 is when Jesus appears to the disciples with Thomas and says, "Behold, touch my hands, touch my side. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones like I do." There's something other than just his physical body, and there's something other than just physical things that exist. In that verse, he notes spirit. And I'll look at the next two verses. Colossians, shot right past it. Colossians 1:15 and 16. It says, "He," that is Jesus, "is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him." So it speaks of an invisible realm. It speaks of Jesus existing before all the things he created. And then this one should get read because it is a beautiful verse. 1 Timothy 1:17. This maybe would have been a good way just to close out this entire talk. But 1 Timothy 1:17 says, "Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen." So reality is not just nature, is what the Bible says. What about personhood? The Bible tells us that you have an essence and you are ensouled. So Genesis 1:26 through 27, let us make man in our image. And so there is an image that all mankind, and some verses say mankind, that's really the idea. It's not just let us make this one individual man, but let us make mankind in our image. So there is such thing as a mankind, and it's made in a particular, or I shouldn't, maybe don't say particular, but it made it in the image of an essence. There's something that all mankind has in common. And then if you look at Genesis 5:1 as well, that kind of reiterates that point when it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God." When he created mankind, it was made in a likeness, where all members of mankind share an essence. And looking ahead at 1 Corinthians 10:13, jump to the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "But no temptation has overtaken you, but that which is common to man." So there is something about mankind, and there's something about our experience that is common. So even our experience can have a common place, an essence to that experience. And then for the soul, I'll just look at a few verses here. If I look at Deuteronomy 6:5, Deuteronomy 6:5 says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." Again, we see the soul written there. And then I will jump just to Psalm 26:9. Psalm 26:9 says, "Do not take my soul away along with sinners, nor my life with men of bloodshed." So there's even a differentiation there, a little bit of soul and life. There's something that is wrapped up in life that is the soul. And then you can continue to look up the other verses as well and see that played out. And finally, regard the biblical response to morality. Morality is objective and prescriptive, and it is lived out before God. So Exodus 20, that's the 10 Commandments again. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Ecclesiastes 12:13. I should have really marked my pages before I started doing this. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "The conclusion when all has been heard is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person." So there's something it's prescriptive and it's objective coming from God. And then Micah 6:8, seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. There's some stuff that you got to do there. You need to seek justice. You need to love mercy. That's part of your morality. But how do you do it? Before God. It's lived out before God. And then if we go to Romans 2:15 for the New Testament as far as morality, Romans 2:15 says, "In that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, that their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them." So there's something, we know it within our conscience, within our hearts, we know it intrinsically that there's an objective morality that weighs on us. And James 4:7 or 4:17, I changed this after your notes. It was a typo again. If you printed off the notes, it was James. I wrote James 4:7 there. It's actually James 4:17. It says, "Therefore, to the one who knows he ought to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." That is our biblical response for reality, personhood, and morality as opposed to scientism. Now, quickly through a general Christian worldview response. Remember we said scientism assumes philosophical and theological truths. I listed some of those things it has to assume in order to even do science. And so scientism rests on a number of philosophical and theological truths. And in fact, not just scientism, but science itself can't even get off the ground. Proper, good science can't even get off the ground without making some philosophical and possibly even theological assumptions. Next, perhaps the universe is orderly and rational because God is rational. Remember, scientism just takes for granted that there's uniformity, there's order in nature, that the laws that govern material things never change, but material things that they govern do change. That's kind of weird, right? So maybe it's all rational and orderly because God is rational and orderly. Next, morality bears on us as objective. Right? There's something we know, like we ought to do this. The low-hanging fruit to address is we ought not torture or kill little or babies for fun, right? That's an easy one. We know that. So, but we just know it. And in fact, I would say we're more sure of something like that than we are of many scientific things we believe. Like how sure are you about the way in which an atom works? Right? Over the past century, atomic theory has changed a number of times in different ways. And it could change again. But do you think in 100 years from now that feeling inside that it is wrong to torture and kill innocent babies can all of a sudden be right? I think we are more sure that it is wrong to do that than we are sure of many scientific things we hold. But maybe it's that morality bears on us as objective and real because, and if it is, or if it does, it's because there's an objective moral law that says something is good or bad. And the only way we can get a moral law is because we have a moral law giver, which would be God. So because the Christian response would be, yes, God exists as a morally perfect being, and he gives us our moral law. And that's why it weighs on us heavily. Next, we each are ensouled and have a first-person perspective. So a soul is part of us. Or we have a soul, or we are a soul. Ways to say that. And we have a first-person perspective. I know who I am. more than you know who I am. You can see me as a third person, but you can't know me like I can from a first person perspective. There's something unique about what I know about myself that nobody else can know. And finally, possibly most importantly, the gospel is true and can be known. If scientism is true, then it makes suspect many other things that we take to be fact or truth, like historical knowledge, which would be very difficult for science to get off the ground without historical knowledge. But we, as Christians, hold to a truth that is historically relevant and uses, among other things, very clearly a historical event, namely the resurrection, as kind of God's crowning achievement of sorts. Where he kind of solidifies our not just our atonement, but our eternal life through that, through the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so it's true and can be known, but it can't be known via scientism. And I think those are some general responses or some things we need to hold as truth as we approach scientism. So that will end us for today. Sorry, I expected this to go much quicker, but there still was more to it. So Sunday night Q&A, send your questions to Neil. Sunday, May 17th, 6 p.m., there's our Facebook Live location. We will be going live again. Neil said we will, I guess Pastor Tim was a little quiet. We'll turn up his mic a little bit or nudge him to talk a little louder. But please be there Sunday night. Send in your questions in advance or send in your questions on the moment when we're on Facebook Live. Hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me again. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much, and God bless you this week.